I'm Cindy Chamberlain Eastwood here, and for Adventist Today, I am here with Laura Ochs. I'm going to butcher the name again. Wibberding. Did I say it right?
Absolutely right. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Excellent. Laura, you are a professor at PUC, one of our Adventist colleges. For those who are watching that are not familiar with that, Laura, can you give me your title, your official title?
My official title is Assistant Professor of Theology, Church History, and Psychology and Social Work. I kind of teach in the overlap between theology and history, mostly there, the Adventist history, world church history, even world religions. And I also do some overlap with psychology and social work with psychology of religion.
Okay. And you're a mom and a wife as well. Excellent. I was listening to a presentation that you gave for Adventist Today about a year ago, talking about the different ways that Christianity has evolved, if you will, from biblical times, which were very warlike, to pacifism of the Vietnam era, some just world theories in there, God and country, different things. Can you give us just a quick overview of how Christians are sort of, how they've dealt with war in the past?
Oh, definitely. So I ended up studying this topic because I wanted to frame church history in a framework that would be interesting to college students. So I started a class called A History of Christian Violence and Nonviolence. And in it, we see three paradigms that Christians have taken in relationship to war. We start out this small persecuted minority who embrace pacifism. And not just any pacifism. This is the kind of pacifism that ends up accepting violence. So you've got the martyrdom of Christians, even public martyrdom, all as a witness. At this point, Christians justify their pacifism. Yeah, we don't participate in wars, but we actually do more good for the empire because of it, because we pray for the good of the empire, and because as more and more people embrace Christianity, fewer of them are going to want to fight you. That's the rationale. However, this ends up changing first with the conversion of Constantine, when suddenly the church is in a partnership with the government. Now we understand that that in a world of sin, the government always has to deal with violence, right? The punishment of the wicked, or even to protect its own citizens against other nations. So now we have to come up with a theology that allows war at least as a necessary evil. And this is where we get the just war theory. The idea that, well, the church can't use violence. The state sometimes has to, but only when it's absolutely necessary, and only when the end goal is greater peace. This just war theory does pretty well for a while, but we have culture change going on as the old Roman Empire falls, and you have those Germanic tribes which embrace war and valor as a much more important cultural value. And eventually we come to the point where we see war as not simply a necessary evil, but a tool that can possibly be used for good, even for God. We get into the high Middle Ages, and the church has become a political power, not simply a religious one. And the church defends its own political interests militarily sometimes. And so it's not such a great step to go over into the Crusades, where the church actually calls a holy war and says, all you people, God wants you to defend his territory in Palestine, and this is going to be a spiritual good if you do this. And from this point on, you've got those three paradigms. When you hit the Reformation era, you've got three different branches, the mainline churches, the Lutherans and the Anglicans that go with the just war. The Calvinist groups, the Reformed churches, which are very often mixing up their fight for religious freedom with politics, and they end up adopting crusades. And then you've got the historic peace churches like the Anabaptists and the Quakers, people who never have any sort of state protection, for whom persecution is a constant. And they end up saying, well, Christians just have to separate from the government completely. So you have full pacifism, no self-defense, and no involvement in government at all. So there's all those three paradigms come back in the Reformation. We come to the United States now, and we're a mix of these things. And while we're technically not a religious state, still you hear echoes of these whenever there is an international conflict going on, whenever there's a possibility of war. People are arguing whether we should get involved or not based on these three different ideals.
So you have these three sort of different paradigms out there and ways of coping and dealing with the reality of war. Some are saying, you know, complete pacifism and the martyrdom, and other people are saying it's just, and under these technical terms, for instance, not killing civilians, not hurting the clergy, not taking unnecessary war battles that don't need to be taken, but just getting what needs to be done. And then you have the other full out crusade. Where would you say Adventism lies in that particular arena of three worldviews?
So Seventh-day Adventist churches cut out a path that is probably somewhere between pacifism and just war. I think we start as an American church, and we've got this mix of backgrounds. You've got the Puritans, who are Calvinists and who embrace the crusade ideal, and you can actually see some of that in the justification for the treatment of Native Americans. America was the new Canaan, it's the new promised land, and you have to move the pagans out, right?
Yeah.
So there's that in our background, and of course we're a mix of members from all these different groups. We also have the Arminian Methodists and even the Quaker influence. And I think when we start out, and initially the church is trying to get to deal with the Civil War, we're just trying to survive. The church is too small to afford to lose all of these members in a war. And so, but we also are a group without power in the government too. So like James White writes an editorial in the Review, even early on, where he says, well, Adventists shouldn't volunteer for the war. But if you're drafted, then the government has told you you have to do this. You have no say in it. And that means that the government is morally responsible for anything that happens after that. And the Adventists have two concerns here. One is the commandment about killing, but the other is about the Sabbath commandment. And they seem to treat them as if they're equally problematic if you join the army here. James White got a lot of pushback from that, though, and so he kind of backs it up. And then the Adventists have to try to figure out some way around this problem that doesn't say the government gets all the moral responsibility, and then the Civil War ends. So we're kind of taken care of there.
But didn't you say in your presentation, did I hear you say in your presentation from a year ago, though, that we paid $300 to get people per person?
Yes. So there was a way out during that time. Although there was no recognition of conscientious objectors by the military at the time, there was the option that if you were drafted, you had to go, or you could find somebody who wanted to go instead, or pay $300, which would supposedly make up for your lack of participation there. So there were some who did pay that, and others who didn't feel morally comfortable doing it. And there were arguments over whether that was okay or not. But again, the end of the war eventually saves us. We didn't actually straighten out that question and come up with an answer We just kind of got through it.
And we didn't really straighten that out until Vietnam, correct? Where we began to really get sophisticated with conscientious objectors and medics, the white coats,
Yeah, so the Quakers were allowed exemption from war eventually. The Quakers have this very strong historic stance of supporting the government, but not participating in war. Quaker persecution was unlike Anabaptist persecution. They were generally banished, not killed. So the Quakers are willing to participate in government, but not use violence to do it. So you're not going to be an executioner or that sort of thing. So this is actually the paradigm that Adventists end up following. It's a modified pacifism where we want to prove that we're supportive of our government, but we want to support them in any way that doesn't involve killing. Yeah, I was going to say something about that, how this works out. One of the problems with it is that the Seventh-day Adventist Church doesn't start out as the most pro-government group in the US. We have these prophecies about the end of time. And in fact, at the time of the Civil War, many Adventists, they don't believe that it's going to bring an end to slavery, because in the book of Revelation, you have references to slavery, it appears, at the very end of time. So they say, well, according to prophecy, the US will never end slavery. So, well, technically, ideologically, we support the North over the South. We're having a hard time getting behind it and feeling it completely anyhow. So this, of course, does not make us look like the most loyal group, the most patriotic group. And this comes around like in World War I and such. The US government actually starts investigating the Adventist Church to see if perhaps we're a seditious group, if perhaps we may be supporting the enemy. And so we have further pressure to prove that we are cooperating, even though we don't want to engage in combat.
So we enter
more complicated.
So we enter kind of on a level trying to prove that we are good US citizens, is what you're saying. Okay.
We actually removed the references to the lamb-like beast being the US from the book Bible Readings for the Home Circle, because our colporteurs were selling that book during, I think it might have been by World War II, but somewhere in there we actually edit that out because we don't want to look so suspicious anymore. And I think that's part of the pressure to show that we are cooperating with the government, and we're willing to take non-combat roles, even though we still want to save the space for our members to not be in actual fighting.
So is that, let me go here, is that where we landed in World War II? Trying to prove that we're supportive people. Take me to World War II.
All right, in World War II, the Adventists are actually getting better at this PR thing with the US government. So US Adventists have a working relationship with the government and the War Department. You have people like Carlisle B. Haynes, who's pretty much an ambassador to the US government. And we're being preemptive too. In World War I, we weren't prepared for all of this. But by World War II, we're ready with the Medical Cadet Corps, and we start training our own young people so that when they get drafted, they're already qualified for a medic role in the military. And this is to save them from being drafted and just thrown in with everybody else and having to carry a weapon and go into combat.
So we're organized. We are organized. We're going to go in. We're going to show we're supportive. Okay. Enter Adventists.
Now, of course, by the time the World Wars come along, the Seventh-day Adventist Church is an international church. Mm-hmm. This, of course, makes it all the more complicated to support one's national government, because you may be fighting against members of your own church who are in a different country, who are having to fight for their national government. In World War I, actually, it was really problematic because the the government, the Adventist church in Europe was centered in Germany. So when the First World War broke out, suddenly the funds for all of our Adventist workers was cut off. Our communication was difficult. It doesn't look very loyal to be sending money outside of the country to countries, that you're at war with. And this made running the church very complicated. By the time we get to World War II, now Adventists are on the defensive in Germany even more than they were in the US. So,
and tell me about our courtship with that, with Hitler.
Yes, so the Adventist church has to prove that they support Hitler specifically. Now, I'm not going to lie about this. There were quite a few of our members really truly did support Hitler. He comes in and he's a vegetarian. Woohoo! We love vegetarians, right? He's supportive of
didn't drink,
families.
didn't smoke. Yes.
He has youth programs. He's the moral candidate, and much as the the Adventist Church is suspicious of conservative values being pushed into politics, we still tend to lean towards the conservative candidates because they reflect our conservative Christian family values. And this is Hitler at this time. Now, the world knows he's anti-Semitic, but so are lots of people, and they don't do what Hitler had done, and I think we're kind of unprepared for that. But the way I understand, when Hitler came into power, one of the very first things that happened was the largest Adventist church in Berlin was closed down. Seventh-day Adventists look suspiciously Jewish because of our practices, our embrace of the Old Testament, our keeping of Sabbath, even our tithing system. All of these things are very Old Testament-ish. So we get the ire of an anti-Semitic leader who actually, well, he's got a secular government going on. He's still trying to control Christianity in Germany. Germany is a very Protestant nation, and he creates this German evangelical church, which is essentially all of the Protestant churches that kind of have to get stuffed together into one box. And they have a generic theology, which is just generalized Christian Protestant teachings, along with nationalism and some elements of ethnic purity. And there's resistance movements. You have people like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who actually joins a resistance movement that ends up trying to assassinate Hitler. He's another German Christian at the time. The Adventists do have some resistance, but it's isolated resistance. We have certain leaders who will actually speak out against the anti-Semitism. We have certain members who try to protect and take care of German citizens, German Jewish citizens and others. But for the most part, you have Adventists generally towing the line, being supportive of Hitler. Some churches even expelled their Jewish Christian members because they didn't want the association with Jews. Everybody was trying to protect themselves. And you have some isolated examples of people who took risks to protect others, but for the most part, the Adventists felt like they were the vulnerable ones and had to protect themselves. And of course, you have this general approval because Hitler seems to support these good family values. It's not until after the war that we have a reckoning with all of these different attitudes.
In that, from a historian perspective, how did that courtship happen? You mentioned the health piece. We aligned with the health piece. We aligned with the core family value piece. But the literature does show that there was correspondence to the GC during that time saying, well, we've had to, kind of compromise on a few things, but our printing presses are continuing to be going and not shut down. Our sanitariums and our hospitals are still operating. So we are continuing this relationship. There's some courtship looking like we as a church are asking for the status. You know, Hitler had a certain status. I forget what that was called for churches to be in line. We're continually fighting for our status. And of course, no one could see where it was going. You know, everyone in Germany was promised a car and a prosperous life and all of those things. So we couldn't see where it was going, but there was a place where we were asked to compromise in forced sterilizations and euthanasia and things like that. And how do we get to that point as a moral people?
All right, so this question is a really big one, and the best that I can do is speculate here, because you're asking, how do we come to the point that we're willing to compromise morally so much because we want to continue our mission, doing the things that we're used to do?
The greater good.
I think just from what I know about the Seventh-day Adventist Church is we have a kind of sense of an isolation from the big narrative of the Christian world around us. We are this prophetic movement and we've got this specific job. And so Adventists focus very much on how we can accomplish our specific mission. If we do this right, if we do this well, particularly the narrative that went around with last generation theology in the 40s and onward is, if we do our part well, then Jesus comes and then Jesus fixes all these other problems, right? We can't get rid of the dictators, but Jesus can. We can't undo racism, but Jesus will. So instead of putting our efforts into the things that the world needs, we focus on the Adventist mission instead. We've got this long history of it where we had Adventists involved in the abolitionist movement in the early days of the church, but we also had Adventists arguing that if you care about this issue, you should instead devote your attention to preaching the second coming so that God can fix it, because there's no way to make other people be moral, right? I think we've got some of that thinking going on then still, that if we just do our part and if we just bring the second coming as soon as possible, then all of these other problems can be taken care of. But I think the Adventist Church excuses somewhat being isolated from the larger problems of our communities and even of the world, because we feel like we have the key to those problems just doing our Adventist thing.
Okay, so if I'm hearing you right then, Laura, we had last generation theology even in the 40s.
Last generation theology is kind of a complicated thing. There are pieces of it at work way back in Adventist history. And I suppose what we call last generation theology kind of comes together and becomes more of a thing later on. But yeah, you already have the idea going around that we've got to, if we complete our mission, then Jesus can come. And that includes having the right characters, perfecting ourselves. If we get our act straight as a church, then Jesus will come. We've always had this existential crisis over why hasn't Jesus come yet? Time just keeps on ticking on. And so we've always had some excuse. What is it that hasn't happened yet? Well, we haven't finished our mission to the whole world, or we haven't done our Adventist thing well enough, whether that has to do with our worldwide preaching or our perfection of character. And of course, we've got issues about the perfection of character from in the past as well. This isn't new to M.L. Andreasen. But
Okay.
of course, Andreasen is the big theologian in the 40s, probably the 30s and 40s at least. So yeah, that was a thing. I think we just started calling it last generation theology as we begin to separate from it maybe in the 60s and such.
Does that then blind us?
I think what really blinds us is our isolation in what you could call the Adventist world. Because we see ourselves as special, and I'm not arguing that we shouldn't see ourselves as special, as having a particular mission. It does make us more inclined to think that we're exempt from the issues that other Christians are dealing with.
Are we exempt?
Oh, absolutely not. Definitely, I'll just give you a straight answer on that one. I think the Seventh-day Adventist Church has a unique perspective, and that's good. Our mission has to do with that, but we are still part of this world community. And the fact that history keeps on going on, we don't know when history is ending. So yeah, if Jesus is coming next year, then maybe our lack of involvement in certain social issues of our time won't make a difference. But if we have another 50 years or another 100, we have no way of knowing that. We miss the opportunity to make things better for people now.
Is it valid? Is it valid when we take Jesus' instruction, go to Samaria, or what? I'm not a theologian, but don't even turn back for if someone talks to you, just keep going. Be about our Father's business. Are these valid things? We're so heaven bound that we can ignore these items.
You make a good point. We are being a Seventh-day Adventist is an important part of my identity, but so is being a Christian. So is being a citizen in the world. So is being a human being in a community of other human beings. And it all matters. It does. When the Seventh-day Adventist Church took its various positions during wars in the past, I'm afraid that we were probably more focused on protecting our own needs and interests as a church. Someone said recently that it kind of makes sense that organizations end up focusing on self-preservation rather than on greater matters of justice and righteousness in the world, because just from a Darwinian perspective, you can say that organizations that don't focus on self-preservation don't tend to be preserved, right? So here we are, and we've stuck around because we've looked after our own interests. But we're going to have to decide in every issue whether our own interests and the preservation of the organization is more important than the human interests around us.
Is that common, though, for all places and times in history?
Absolutely. So you get to when the Middle Ages end, when you have the secularization of governments in Europe, the United States, everywhere, we're no longer making our decisions about war on the basis of our Christian faith, ostensibly, although you still hear the governments use the language of just war. When they want to fight a war, there's always someone being harmed, right? And we have to go in and protect them. This is true in every war situation. And it's not a lie. Someone is always being harmed. I'll admit that. But the church positions on war tend to follow the government positions, so that you've got denominations that take different positions based on where they're located. During the world wars, most of the Christian churches took a position that lined up with that of their national government. And by the time we get to the end of World War II, we are so morally wrung out. You could say that eventually Christians quit trying to make sense of it theologically. And we say, maybe there isn't a just war. Maybe it's all just war, to use the words of Roland Bainton, the church historian. So yeah, I think we are always conditioned by our circumstances. Much as we want to take our theology out of scripture and base our moral stands on that, what we see and what we experience and what we need as a group or as an individual has a lot to do with what we decide is right and wrong, or most important to focus on in our time.
So tell me, as a historian, what is your advice on how we morally, ethically, spiritually decide where we align with our government and where we don't? If you're saying historically it shows that even in just war theories, at the end of the day, we align as people again and again and again with what self-preserves and what makes sense in our own worldviews, what would be the godly Christian response to war, even the war in Ukraine at this moment? What is the criteria? And is just war an oxymoron? Where do we at the end of the day fall in even making rational choices about our response to war as spiritual people?
You bring up the example of Ukraine, and it's a very potent one. Ukraine, like many wars, when they come up, they make people question their pacifism. If you're a pacifist, what do you think should be happening now? I certainly don't want Ukraine to be passive against the aggression of Russia. I did hear of an opinion, an editorial article suggesting that the Ukrainians are wrong for fighting back and that they should use nonviolent resistance in this instance. I would like to be a pacifist, but we live in a world with sin and violence, and you cannot, by not being violent, keep violence from happening. Which means that we are going to live in a world which is always morally complex, where there's no way that by my individual choice I can make the right things happen. Unfortunately, my advice, by the way, I ask my students about their personal convictions when I teach a class on Christian violence and nonviolence, and almost all of them come up with some sort of variation on just war. But because none of us wants to see violence happen against innocent people and there not be consequences for it, right? My best advice is to understand that we are being conditioned by our circumstances. There's no way, there's no ethical position that we can take that isn't going to end up with innocent people being harmed, unfortunately. And when we look back on history, we have to make moral choices in the moment. In World War II, people felt very certain about the morality of the Allies side versus the Axis, and that we were doing good by stopping them, and they're not wrong, but it wasn't the whole picture. When we get to the perspective of history, things turn out to be much more morally complicated. And there's good and bad going on all sides. So I guess my warning would be against dogmatism. We have to live in the current moment where we are. We have to make choices, whether we're going to support our government or not, whether we're going to engage in fighting or not, whether we're going to vote for this war or this person who engaged in war or not. And we're just going to have to do the best that we can. But it's important to remember that those moral choices are being conditioned by the part of the picture we can see right now and the circumstances that we're in. And we must not give ourselves over wholeheartedly to any political position, because those things are going to look different in time to us. My advice, what I end up telling students, is that we all just have to do the best that we can, and try to see outside of ourselves, outside of our own circumstances, try to remember compassion for all people, no matter what side of the lines they're on, and to remember God is with us in the moral complexity. I think he understands the limitations of what we can and can't see, and helps us to make the best choices that we can. In the end, those early Adventists were right. The only solution is going to be when Jesus does come and fix that.
So am I hearing you say that it's so morally complex that you really are not pointing your students to sort of a list or a criteria of what our response to war should be, but that it is a very time-consuming, very morally complex issue that we must just wrestle with. It's a reality we have to wrestle with as humans on a fallen planet.
Yeah, so I hope through the lens of history that my students get to see how people making moral choices were affected by the limits of their own experience, that they did what seemed right at the time, but it seemed right because of all these other influences on them, so that they realize that we're having to do the same thing. I do try to show them enough of the horrors of violence so that they know we have to take these choices seriously. Harm to other human beings is always so much more harmful, essentially, than it appears. We get used to seeing violence and thinking of violence in calculating terms, in theoretical spaces where we say, okay, this many people die if we do this, or say, this many people will die if we drop the atomic bomb, right, on Japan at the end of World War II. And we say, if we don't drop the atomic bomb, we'll have this many deaths, just guessing, and we make a calculation and say, okay, this is the best thing to do morally in this case. We get insulated from the actual harm of violence. So we have to discipline ourselves to see the long-term harm that comes to other people, even from small acts of violence, and to know that those are the stakes involved when we're making choices. But yes, at the end of the day, I don't tell them what position they need to take. I had a student who said, well, you know, I don't want to get marked off for this, but I kind of think that sometimes violence is the answer, he said.
What did you say?
There wasn't very much I could say. He was using just war arguments there. And I was hoping that through the content that he got in class that he saw that, well, maybe just war was the best option that we had, but it never actually solves our problems. We may end up with problems we can live with better than the ones that we were trying to get rid of with the violence, but we always have to live with the consequences of the harm that we've done in those cases. So yeah, I don't tell the students what they have to believe. That'd be kind of hypocritical of me. But I do hope to show them what stakes are involved and help them to see that their own opinions are culturally conditioned, just like everyone else's were.
Let me ask you two questions. One thing is, I noticed in your presentations, you said that you're excited about the classes you teach because you're able to take topics that students are interested in and intertwine, some Adventist values and things in it in kind of repackaged ways that they wouldn't ordinarily want to hear, say, church history, but you can put it into a curricula. And I just thought that was really neat. I would like you to speak about that. And then also, at what level too do you see a conditioning of society, with violent video games and different things? Certainly the forum that you were in even went into some issues like are the Pathfinders marching in ways that look militaristic and things like that. But certainly I think as parents, I think we live in a pretty violent society, but then you can't argue that it's more violent because in the 40s we had World War II that was extremely violent to 6 million Jews. So you can't say we're here and they were there. But can you just speak to the issue of teaching your students and sort of the semi-violent world we're in at this point as well too in time?
All right. Yeah, I was saying when we did those seminars about how much I enjoy being at PUC because I have some freedom to look into topics of interest to students. I cannot understand when people tell me I don't find history interesting. I'm so bored by history.
Fascinating.
I was looking for a way to frame history in terms that they were interested in. So violence and nonviolence seemed like a good way that I could tell the story of Christian history, pardon me, based on moral decisions that the church made. And of course, in this frame, you get some of the more exciting stories of church history, the martyrdoms, crusades, the Inquisition. Even looking at nonviolent movements, you've got the civil rights movement, which had different perspectives, but there was definitely a Christian nonviolent movement going on then in the 60s. And I think the Black church doesn't get as much attention as it ought to for this. So I like being able to take things that are of interest to the students and use them as a segue or as a frame for which to look at history. Honestly, history or even any of the academic subjects are really only relevant where they connect with what we experience today. And so I think it's completely legitimate to take something like that and use it as a frame for teaching that. I'm not trying to sneak in, like sneaking the vegetables into the casserole. I'm trying to show them that these concepts and these values are relevant for them now. And that's the thing that I've really enjoyed being able to do at PUC. As for the violence of our times, you're right. We are certainly used to violence in our entertainment. But other generations were used to violence, experiencing it in war. And as much as I think, we get jaded about violence, we get used to seeing violence. And when we're thinking in the theoretical, we can be cavalier about it because of all these influences. However, I would stop short of saying that this is leading to actual physical violence. That's a touchier subject, and it's not one that I really have an expertise on. I do know that seeing violence in real life definitely feels different. You're going to have students who have played violent video games. I actually have one of my former youth from a previous church who is right now in Ukraine. I'm trying to figure out, just see a little bit of this on Facebook. We came with a bunch of aid stuff and is busy trying to figure out how to make makeshift body armor there, I guess, for people who are volunteering. But we have young people who are used to the cavalier attitude of violence, who are going to change their perspective when they see real violence. I honestly believe that. because you see real people being harmed. On the screen, you cut away from the dead body, right? You don't have the months, the years or decades of grieving afterward. You don't have the experience of trying to patch up someone's injury after it. The reality of violence always impacts us in a different way than the theory of violence. This is why I want students to see some of what the reality of it is when they're trying to consider what cost is high enough to warrant violence as a response to it.
What do you think is your greatest challenge as a historian today?
History is exciting and it's fun, and keeping that reality perspective is probably my greatest challenge. I love to read tactical histories of battles and see how people thought through on the rational side how best to approach it. In the Crusades, you've got these stories of I won't get into the stories. The thing is, the stories fascinate me. The problem is trying to conceptualize the intensity of the harm that's involved, that's behind those stories, the things that came after the story, the things people had to deal with. I don't want to overwhelm students, and I don't want to pretend that we can just say, okay, well, the answer is to be pacifists, and if we were all pacifists, we would fix this. So I guess, yeah, maybe the complication is really holding on to that moral ambiguity in a topic in which there is just so much moral potency.
Yeah.
There's so much wrong that goes on in violent situations.
Yeah.
It's so bad. It's easy to say this is absolutely wrong, or to say, well, coming in and fighting this evil person was absolutely right. And that's just never the whole picture. It's never as simple as that. Christian history is full of examples of where we end up excusing and even endorsing violence because we've embraced the Crusader ideal because we wanted to do moral good. But we end up, the chivalry tradition in the Middle Ages, the current partnership that you have going on between the US military and evangelical Christian churches in the US. You get a distortion of Christianity because we were trying to address the moral of war there. And we said, well, it was right to fight this evil person, therefore being violent can be good. And we end up endorsing harm. So yeah, my biggest challenge is not actually getting the students interested in the subject matter. It's always fascinating. It's untangling from that fascination the actual human cost, the human harm, and keeping that tension that while we have to live with sin and violence, we have to be aware every time we choose a violent response what the cost is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That makes sense to me, and I hear that in your voice. The idea that you're dealing with some very, very weighty issues, and at the end of the day, even a really great 300-page essay cannot really make sense of all those thoughts and ideas and loose ends and the repercussions and the effects of these wars and things like that. It is weighty. Don't you think too, at the end of the day, that is why leadership is so important, and the ideologies that we follow and not being reckless with the news and not being reckless with our words. Because certainly long before we ever go to war, we have at the grassroots level bought into some form of what we believe should happen. Go enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll weigh in after the Ukraine war with you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for your time.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.